Well, thank you, Ian, Professor Ian Martin, for your very kind introduction and very academic, but not just academic, I think insightful introduction, and probably stole half of my speech, but that's okay. I won't hold that against you. It was important. I do want to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all here today, and Ramadan Mubarak to all my Muslim brothers and sisters. It is a very special time of the year for Muslims, and those of us who have come from that part of the world, in the Middle East, for example, my parents are from Egypt, the sharing of Ramadan, whether you were Christian or Muslim, was something that we all participated in, and we have continued that with our family, with some of my aunties and uncles who happen to be Muslim. So that's a special time for all of you, and I'm really privileged to be here with the Iftar, for this Iftar with Deakin. And I would say though, if I'm not sure if this is protocol, Seki, but if my speech goes too long past 8 o'clock or our Q&A, I know we have to wait for the Quranic recital, but there are dates and what are there people do feel they need to break the fast. I'm fasting as well, so I'll keep my remarks as short as possible. Thank you to Deakin University, to Professor Ian Martin, Vice-Chancellor of Deakin, also Professor Fethi Mansouri, and all the other professors here. I know I can see Jenny Lighthow, Professor Lighthow, and Michelle Grossman, and lots of people, Shahram. I know a lot of people at Deakin for various reasons. Lydia's not here tonight, she's travelling back from Canberra, but she's also part of Deakin University's family, so it's great to be here tonight. I know there's a few academics here, but before I do that, I just want to say too that it is a profound mark of respect that we always, and Professor Martin did that, acknowledge country. And it's been a difficult year for Indigenous Australians with the loss of the referendum, but it is a profound mark of respect to acknowledge Indigenous nations and their the fact that they've been here since the beginning of recorded time, over 60,000 years, and there's much more work to be done, and it is very much part of the work that I know this university is doing and all of us are committed to. I know there's some academics here, and maybe some students as well, so I'm going to throw out a quote and see who can pick who this is. And it's not as historic as Jonathan Rolls, but let's see if anyone guesses it. And the quote is, "All the great evils which men cause to each other because of certain intentions, desires, opinions, or religious principles are likewise due to non-existence, because they originate in ignorance, which is absence of wisdom." Anyone know who that is?
Jan Smith?
No, a bit more historic than that. Much longer. I won't keep you all in suspense. That person is Musa bin Maimun, who was the personal physician and advisor to the great Sultan Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, who was the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. He was also a Sephardic Jew. And another great scholar at the time, Ibn Rushd, who was known as the father of rationalism, wrote 100 books and treatises on philosophy and theology and medicine and astronomy and physics and mathematics and Islamic jurisprudence. And he said this about the value of interfaith and intercultural collaboration when he was actually commenting on the controversy at the time about the incorporation of Greek thought into the Muslim world. And he said, and I quote, "If before us someone has inquired into wisdom, it behooves us to seek help from what he has said. It is irrelevant whether he belongs to our community or to another." Now, these scholars and philosophers, and tell me if I'm pronouncing this correctly, the academics, all lived and worked together, Muslims, Christians and Jews, during what was known then as a period called the conviviencia, which is living together. It was a Spanish word that described that coexistence during the period between the 8th and 13th, 14th century, where there was a degree of intercultural interfaith and intercultural and economic collaboration that led to a flourishing of ideas, of knowledge, and this occurred during and under the Umayyad and later in the Taifa kingdoms. And there was the school of Toledo, which was also a Christian city that was after the Reconquest, and even in that context, Muslims, Christians and Jewish scholars worked together, and they contributed to translating so many scientific Arabic texts into languages for the West, which actually led to many of the bases, if you like, for the Renaissance and the flourishing of that influence. Now, of course, like many ideas, the idea of conviviencia has been challenged, being somewhat of a myth, The reality was far, far worse. There was much more conflict. There was much more tension and sectarian difference. And of course, it wasn't perfect. Always there are challenges and tensions. But I don't think I need to be a historical expert to say one can make an argument that for those historical periods, there is ample evidence that the peoples, the communities, the leaders at the time actually made choices to live together, to work together, to be together, rather than to fight each other over their sectarian or ideological differences. That was a choice that was made. And for that period of history, there were special connections made which have actually survived the test of time. And in the midst of this period, there was also war and conflict, because, of course, people can't always prevent themselves from feeling that their differences are insurmountable. And, of course, this led to the spilling of blood, and a lot of blood. In that period, as any other period, particularly the one we are in today, there's always going to be that tension, and the choices have to be made. In the midst of the bloody battles of the Fifth Crusade, such as the siege of Damietta in Egypt, where tens of thousands of people perished during those crusades, there was a curious story in 1219 that demonstrated such a choice. Two monks went on what was seen by their leaders as a suicide mission. They decided to cross enemy lines to seek an audience with the Sultan Malik al-Kamil. Now, there are varying accounts of this episode, of this encounter, but it was characterised, on most of the accounts, I've looked at some of the primary sources, by mutual respect. The academics like that. Mutual respect, discussions that focused on philosophy, faith, and peace. And this is often cited as an early example of interfaith dialogue. And some accounts relate that the monks sought to preach to Malik al-Kamil, and some even said that they sought to convert him. Shock horror. For his part, Sultan Malik al-Kamil assumed that these holy men were emissaries of the Crusaders, and they were received very courteously and peacefully and respectfully. Now, some in his court demanded that they execute these monks for having the gall to come and try and preach to the Sultan. Instead, the Sultan heard them out, and they had a very long conversation that was very fruitful, and he escorted them safely back to the Crusader camp. And as far as practical outcomes go, in dialogue, the monks did obtain a commitment from the Sultan for more humane treatment of Christian captives in the war. Now, these two monks were Illuminato del Rieti and Brother Francis, who was then became better known as St. Francis of Assisi. And I think his example of action and that of Sultan Malik al-Kamil, that can be a guide, because even for that brief moment in the midst of terrible war, where there was fighting all around them, their conduct became instruments of peace. They made a choice to sow love instead of hatred, or to sow love where there was hatred surrounding them. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near, I'm not near anywhere the wisdom of Musa ibn Maimon or Ibn Rushd, or the spiritual courage of St. Francis, or even the philosopher king status of a sultan like Malik al-Kamil. But I am going to posit a view that I think everyone in this room would share, and that is, we all aspire to a set of values that was probably shared by those great historical figures, and indeed many of the people of the time. And those values spread from places of learning, they spread from places of worship, and these values that we have today can also spread from many of other sectors of our society, whether it's academia, whether it's sporting clubs, whether it's business, whether it's the corridors of political power. And these values are all about protecting and enhancing the cohesion of our society, which we've all said is very important. And what does that mean? That despite the many differences, whether they be sectarian, ethnic, political, ideological, some of which may be very deep, that vehement disagreement that we might have, despite those differences, in spite of those, we would still aspire to engage with each other, to navigate those differences peacefully and respectfully, and that we value the relative cohesion and harmony which characterises the society that we currently live in. That we do not accept expressing our difference or disagreement through hate speech or other forms of vilification or conflict or violence. And so these characteristics, these values, there's no secret sauce to social cohesion. It is quite simple. It's about a choice to embrace and embody those values. And it was displayed and demonstrated by some of those historical figures in very difficult times. Probably, you could argue, more difficult than today. We're not in the midst of the Fifth Crusade. The choice is what is important. And that choice is starting with courage. Courage to overcome hatred, to see beyond the difference and not let the poison of hatred overwhelm our hearts and our minds when it comes to engaging with those that, well, they may very well be worlds apart from us on so many levels. There's also a commitment to peace and to the idea that we can resolve differences peacefully through robust but respectful debate and dialogue and engagement, that we can make big decisions for our society and our nation through a peaceful democratic process as well. And a conviction, and I think this is probably the most important, a conviction that our shared humanity actually sits above whatever difference we have with each other. That our base emotions that lead us to hatred and violence, which we all have as human beings, we're all flawed, these can be defeated by the power of our empathy, our compassion and our love for our fellow human beings. And that fact of our shared humanity is a far more powerful and valuable part of who we are as human beings than our petty points of difference. Now, that's a bit academic, but I will say that a lot of these values and these characteristics are embodied by people of faith, by people in our community, by people like Ahmed Keskin, who is part of the AIS, who co-sponsored this wonderful Iftar tonight, by Deakin University and the people that work here. You care and you embody those values in everything that you do. So it's not just about government, social cohesion, it's about everything that you do in this room. You know, the Prime Minister appointed me as Special Envoy for Social Cohesion in July last year, and I thought, wow, all the problems of the country are now mine to solve. How am I going to do that? Thank you, Prime Minister. But he asked me to engage closely with Minister Tony Burke, Minister for Home Affairs, Minister Julian Hill on Multicultural Affairs, with the Special Envoys for Anti-Semitism, Gillian Siegel, and for Islamophobia, Iftar Malik, and I've met with them. He asked me to engage with the relevant state and territory governments to ensure that there's a nationally consistent approach on the work that we do. But one of the big tasks I was given was to really not just understand, but try and help define and articulate what we mean by social cohesion as an ongoing part of the role that I have. And I've thought about it a lot, obviously. But I think even my experience before that helped me in this. Before politics, I worked for SBS, a wonderful multicultural broadcaster, multilingual and multicultural broadcaster. I worked as a Victorian Multicultural Commissioner. And I've always been a passionate advocate and committed really to our multicultural, multi-faith, multi-ethnic society, a pluralistic society, because of frankly what it gave me and my family. When they migrated from Egypt over 50 years ago, it was not an easy migration. They were fleeing persecution, they were fleeing war, and you know, they were given an opportunity in this country, but they faced many obstacles. Discrimination was quite rife. Racism was significant, particularly in the 70s and 80s. It was much more overt and in your face. I remember experiencing that growing up and going to school in the 70s and 80s. But I think despite all of those obstacles, we got a fair go. And that's another wonderful Australian value. We were given that opportunity to have success. And I think that sense of the fair go for people wherever they come from, whatever their faith background is, whatever their ethnicity is an important, positive value. That we can make a contribution back to the country, to the society that we live in, that has been built over generations by millions of Australians. Millions of Australians have made a choice. And multicultural Australia didn't just happen because there was some law that was put out of Parliament or some politician said we should be multicultural. It was because of the commitment, it was because of the courage of millions of Australians of all backgrounds. It was because of their commitment to it, and it was their conviction that this is the type of society we want to live in. And they made that commitment. So my working definition of social cohesion may not be as eloquent as Musa Ibn Maimun or Ibn Rushd, but in plain speak, I articulate it as follows. How we interact with each other as individuals, as members of organisations or institutions, which are of course made up of people, how we interact with each other and do so in a way that despite what might be very deeply held disagreement and difference, that interaction still occurs peacefully and respectfully and doesn't flip over into hate speech, vilification or violence. That's the essence of social cohesion, making a choice to engage with your so-called enemy and not see them as an enemy or someone that you disagree with peacefully and respectfully. When you can navigate that difference in that way, you're adding to social cohesion, and it adds a ripple effect every time it happens. And when I say it's not just about governments, it's about every individual. I mean, these are old-fashioned maybe concepts of basic decency to others. And your willingness, people's willingness and ability to do this depends also on something important, that is their sense of belonging in the society they're in. Because if they're going to invest back into the society, they have to feel like that the society is investing in them. They have to feel like they belong. And of course, many members of our community sometimes feel disconnected, disenfranchised, that they're not part of the society. And that is problematic. So whatever our sense of Australianness and the way that we describe or define Australianness is actually quite an important concept. What does it mean to be Australian? How do I belong to this country? I recall growing up in this country and being told, the usual, go back to where you came from, or, where were you born, where you're from. And I would say, I'm from Melbourne. And so, no, but where are you from? I said, well, I was born in Melbourne. What do you want me to say? This is where I'm from. This idea of belonging to a place is actually very important. And I think it's also, incumbent upon us about how we show that basic decency to others and empathise with others with different perspectives, and we think about how we say things and what we say to them. That matters as well. Unfortunately, there are a lot of challenges that we're facing as a society and to cohesion. It's under threat. And it doesn't depend just on successful multiculturalism. It's much, much broader than that. In fact, when you look at what is challenging our ability to navigate through those differences, there are a number of drivers, and I think Professor Martin touched on Jonathan Rawls. This might be going into a bit of Rawls' theory of justice without me knowing it, but things like socioeconomic disadvantage, the cost of living crisis, affects so many Australians. That disadvantage and also intergenerational unfairness and the disparity that is intergenerational. These are genuine grievances. These are real. People feel them, and they give rise to what I would consider to be legitimate grievances. And so, this is a social cohesion issue because when people feel disempowered in that way, when they feel disconnected in that way, they don't feel belonging, they don't feel like they belong to the society, and they feel disillusioned. And so that genuine grievance can often be manipulated as well by malign actors. When they feel disconnected, they are susceptible to the us versus them thinking of scapegoating of minorities or religious minorities or others. And of course we see political populism rife across the globe, and that type of populism seeks to, as I said, malign actors, seeks to deliberately exploit these genuine grievances for their short-term political gain by sowing further division and discord and playing the outsiderism card and saying that the political class is failing us. So you look at the classic populist speech, it's creating some sort of fear, something to be afraid of, saying that the democracy is failing us, or the political class, or the deep state, or the parliament, or whatever it is failing, coming up with some outrageous slogan that is never going to work, practically, and continuing to whip up that anger for their gain. And it wasn't always like this, and I've seen, unfortunately, I was first elected in 2016, I've seen an increase in that kind of populist rhetoric and that kind of politics just in our own country, let alone what we're seeing in Europe and in North America. I worked very closely with people from different political parties. The committee system was a wonderful system, no one knows about it, because all you see is question time and people shouting at each other. But when we work together in parliamentary committees, we work constructively, whether it's Liberal or Green or Labor or Independent, we work, or Nationals, we work very closely. And we listen to each other. We disagree, but we try and find a consensus to recommend good policy. That's broken down. People are more populist. They just want to put out the social media post and try and whip up a bit of anger and frenzy to get more followers and get more votes. So this is the polarisation that we're seeing right across the political spectrum. And there's also the media fragmentation that is part of what we're living through now. Social media and access to digital technology has great benefits for society. right across society. But it also has a dark side. It also has a malign side. And that fragmentation and the way that algorithms are designed to increase clicks and likes and views, and they thrive on fear and anger and outrage. They create terrible conditions for sensationalism. And of course, the misinformation and disinformation laid over that, you see the cocktail that further exacerbates division. These are serious challenges to the cohesion of our society, because people get drawn into different pockets of difference, different realities effectively when their facts aren't even the same, and they have difficulty even engaging with each other on the same points of reference. So in a sense, people become more fearful as well of expressing themselves openly, and they are worried about saying something wrong as well, because they can express an ideological view or a political view that might be condemned, and it pushes people into more extreme positions of potential violence even and conflict. I've heard a lot of stakeholders that I've met with tell me that people are afraid to discuss issues or bring up issues, whether it's here or at home, because they might say the wrong thing. So I'll say this, and I've said it publicly. I back 100% the peaceful right to protest in this country. It is a fundamental democratic right, whatever it might be, as long as it is peaceful and respectful and it doesn't cross over into violence or attacking someone because of their faith. But it's a fundamental democratic right which we should all back in 100%. There was a constituent of mine. I did a street stall, I'll say up in the north of my electorate in Glenroy, and you do these street stalls all the time, and he came up to me, and this was during Trump 1, it was 2017 or 2018, I'll never forget this, and he said to me, he started shouting at me or something, and I said, what's your problem, mate? And he said, no, if I tell you, you're going to accuse me of being a racist. So what's your problem? And he said, you should stop all the Muzzies coming into Australia. No more Muslims in Australia. Yes, they're terrorists. I said, really? And so one thing, I could have made a choice there and said, push the guy away and stop talking to him and just put him in the basket of ignorant, racist, whatever. I decided to talk to him. I said, why are you saying that? He said, because they'll come out. I said, well, do you know, first of all, let me tell you something. All of any security threats, and I'm coming from people who are Muslim, people who are coming to this country to migrate. The people coming to this country to migrate go through health checks and security checks. They're engineers and doctors and lawyers. They're people who want to work as entrepreneurs, and they're contributing to this society. And he mumbled something about, terrorism again. And I said, do you know that are you saying that we're supposed to decide our immigration based on religion? What if a future government said we're not going to let any Italians in to Australia because we don't like the Italians? He said, that would never happen. So what happened in World War II with that, Australians were interred as enemies. He goes, really? I said, where do you work? He said, Coles. I said, what do you do? I said, I'm a driver, a Coles driver. I said, who do you work with? He said, my mate Mo. Is your mate's name Mohammed? He goes, yeah. Okay, so people don't make the connections, right? It took me 45 minutes, but eventually he's like, yeah, fair enough. I get what you're saying. I said, well, Mo's your mate, he's a good bloke. Anyway, so it takes an effort, but you've got to try and engage people where they are and not push them away or accuse them. Try and be patient and try and actually talk through these issues with them, because most people are fair-minded. Of course, there's a very small minority that are not. And that is the most concerning thing for me. There is a minority of people who consider that an expression of their political or ideological views, it's acceptable to use violence to do that. That's concerning to us. And it's concerning because it's not an insignificant minority. Now, government can try and address all these issues, as we do. There are initiatives to address all these tensions that cause people to veer towards othering and pushing others away. We try and encourage communities to come together and help each other feel that sense of belonging. That type of work takes a lot of effort across multiple ministries. It's a sort of a whole of government approach, to use the jargon. But it also requires us to tackle things like the socioeconomic disparities, the cost of living pressures. These are huge priorities that we have invested in, whether it's our tax cuts or cheaper childcare or wage increases for the lowest paid Australians, the cheaper medicines, the cutting of the HEC step and so on. Medicare, for example. These are important because they are sending a message to the public that we do care about the pain that you're going through. But of course, raising awareness of all this is important, articulating is important, and that's a difficulty. We have done a lot around social cohesion. We've spent 90 million, but sometimes people don't see all of this unless it's coming directly to them. I will say this though, these efforts to programs that will try and address these issues include not just in the multicultural space, but they include things like funding digital literacy programs for schools and backing the important work of the E-Safety Commissioner around the threats on social media. And of course, we've seen terrible threat just yesterday to a mosque in Sydney, and I think there was an arrest on that. Other efforts include programs for addressing things like social isolation, loneliness, preventing domestic violence, countering radicalisation and violent extremism. And we've got to give opportunities for people from all backgrounds and all different perspectives to come together and engage with each other, to reflect, to have those difficult conversations, those constructive conversations, to recognise that shared humanity. And that's particularly a priority for me. I think sports and arts are a really great vehicle to bring people together because it bonds people in a way, teaches resilience and teamwork and leadership, and doesn't matter what your background is, you can actually work together towards a common goal. That's why I've been trying to invest in that type of work. Today we announced $15 million for the Bashar Houli Foundation and the Aspire Centre of Sports Excellence. They've been working on the Islamic College of Sports in my electorate of Wills. This is going to be an amazing new centre where young Muslim Australian athletes and non-Muslim people are coming together through something like sports, which will make a huge difference to their life. These are things that serve to ameliorate and mitigate some of the risks that we face in social cohesion, uplift that resilience that we're talking about, and facilitate our capacity as a society to navigate through difference and disagreement peacefully. Every time, as I said, an individual or a member of society or a member of a group reaches out in a peaceful and respectful way through disagreement, they are creating and adding to that social cohesion. They're creating that ripple effect. Every time an individual does that, it matters. Every time a community does that, it's even more powerful, and the same for all the different sectors, because that is modelling behaviour that others follow as well. I know there's more to do, and we've seen in the last few weeks the terrible Islamophobic attack in Epping, just in the north of Melbourne here, where there were 2 separate attacks against Muslim women. The online threats to the mosque in Sydney, which I know you've seen in the news. These are violent, unacceptable, and it should go without saying that Muslim Australians have the right to go about their day in peace and safety. Yet we're saying it. And we've seen a 600% increase in Islamophobic attacks, and that's been on the Islamophobic register. They've done good work in tracking that. A lot of these incidents are probably underreported, as many Muslims, particularly women, feel that they may not be taken seriously or they're afraid to actually raise this. We've seen terrible increases in anti-Semitic attacks on synagogues, places of worship. What is the tragic element in all of these is that there has been a rise in hatred. What possesses people to attack a place of worship like that? That's so tragic, because if that is more than a minority, and I hope it's not, I really hope it's limited to a very small minority within our society. I would like to think that it's true to say that the vast majority of Australians, whatever their background, would reject that proposition, that violence is a means to express oneself in that way. Whether you're Muslim, Hindu, atheist, Jewish, Christian, or of no faith, you have a right to live in peace and security, and it is one of the highest priorities of government, as it should be. Freedom of religion and freedom from religion is a fundamental principle of a functioning democracy. It sits in parallel with the important separation of religion and state as well as a principle. And you can see these principles out of our religious scriptures. In ayah, or verse 256 of Al-Baqarah in the Holy Quran, it says, "Let there be no compulsion in religion, for the truth stands out clearly from falsehood." And some of you might be familiar with Matthew 22:21, where Jesus exhorts his followers, when asked whether they should pay taxes, "Render unto Caesar what is the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." The separation. I want to reinforce that social cohesion should never be used as a term to avoid addressing structural racism. Now, I've had a very good meeting with Giri Sivaraman, the Race Discrimination Commission. We had a great talk about this because Giri's made some points about this, and I said, look, You're doing great work. The anti-racism framework is fantastic work. It's important work. But I said to him, I think acknowledging the truth of racism goes hand in hand with our efforts to promote having a peaceful coexistence. They're not contesting concepts. They shouldn't be contesting concepts in any way. We're always going to have disagreement and difference. And we need to tackle structural racism as part of our efforts. There's no question about this. It's how we navigate this question as individuals, which is important. And that skill to navigate goes hand in hand with fighting discrimination and racism where it exists. So if Mario, that was his name, he was Italian-Australian, who I met in Glenroy, if he was not able to maybe respond to what I was trying to explain and continue down a different path, of course we have to tackle that. That's an issue. But you can do both at the same time. We can tackle this together, whether it's through our normative arguments, whether it's legal mechanisms, whether it's our engagement. So in conclusion, I don't think social cohesion happens by accident. It's a sustained effort propelled forward by the goodwill and the effort of those involved, by every one of you. When there's a normative framework that we all adhere to and we benefit from, there's a commitment to that by all individuals and sectors in our society. And government is just one aspect of this. It contributes, it's a very important contribution. It also helps with the leadership around the cultural and normative standards. And it's an important one. And the real importance of political engagement in this is political leadership that seeks to bring people together rather than divide them. That's what we need. There's a difference between a politician and a political leader. Big difference. I've learned that over my time. It takes a lot more courage and it's a lot more difficult to be a political leader. It's very easy to be a politician. I can pull out any scare campaign I want, any fear, anything that I could whip up a frenzy around. It's much harder to do what you think is right for the nation and the society. But I don't think that leadership can be just political. It can't be just from government, as I said. We need that from all sectors of society to protect our harmonious and relatively harmonious society. From business, from sports clubs, from NGOs, community leaders, academia, the arts, the media, many other organisations, they all play a critical role in setting the norms and cultural standards by which all of us live within and benefit from. And as individuals, as Australian citizens, we are privileged with so many benefits. We also have obligations and responsibilities to protect and enhance our harmonious society. And we can do that, as I said, by making our small contribution. I've got confidence that we can do that when we work together. There's enough of us that can build a momentum to push back against the hatred, to push back against the idea that hatred and violence is a way of expressing oneself. I want to say and thank Ahmed Keskin and Deakin University because you haven't given up on interfaith dialogue. I commend you for that, I really do. It's an act of courage and leadership, and it's an act which is even more necessary when the time is most difficult. When it's most hard to do, that's when you do it. That's when you reach out. And so I commend you on that, especially in the period that we've been facing. And my last thing I want to leave you with is a quote. Someone's got to guess this one. You're going to get this, Ahmed, I think. Interfaith dialogue is a must today, and the first step in establishing it is forgetting the past, ignoring polemical arguments, and giving precedence to common points, which far outnumber polemical ones. You know who that is?
Fethullah Gulen.
Fethullah Gulen. I thank you for that, and I thank you for having me here today.